True calm is rare. It's a sharp clarity that remains when everything around you is trying to knock you off balance. When someone yells, when the threat feels real, when something inside you wants to lash out, explode, run, and yet, you don't act on impulse. You stay whole. But where does that kind of calm come from? Because staying calm in a moment of conflict isn't just a skill. It's a way of being. It's not something you improvise. It's something you build. The human mind, according to Carl Jung, is made of layers. Some visible, others hidden deep below. And when those layers grind against each other, what rises to the surface is tension, anger, fear, resentment. The calm we look for in tough moments isn't about suppressing these emotions. It's about how we relate to them. That's where real transformation happens. When your awareness can hold its gaze, even in the face of what it least wants to see. Jungian psychology offers us a compass. It speaks of archetypes, the shadow, the tension of opposites, the unconscious as a living part of our experience. These might sound like abstract concepts, but they describe with surprising precision what happens in a traffic argument, a messy relationship, a panic attack, or that split second when you feel like you're about to lose yourself. What Jung revealed are maps, blueprints for navigating the invisible landscapes of the self, but reading those maps takes practice. It takes internal clarity, and that's exactly why sometimes the best way to understand what's going on inside is by observing someone who's mastered the chaos outside. Picture someone who stood face to face with the extreme, someone who lived through situations where there was no room for distraction and no second chance to hesitate. Someone who, in the most critical confrontations, had to keep their mind razor sharp, because even the smallest misstep meant losing everything. That man was real, and he left behind teachings that survived centuries, languages, and belief systems. His name was Miyamoto Musashi, a wandering warrior from feudal Japan, who took part in dozens of duels where mistakes weren't an option, and who later, in silence, sat down to write a book that isn't just about winning. It's about how to stay calm in any conflict. What Musashi discovered on the battlefield of both strategy and spirit aligns beautifully with Jung's psychology. Though separated by time, culture, and language, they speak of the same battle, the one that doesn't happen out there, but within. And maybe it's in this unlikely intersection, between a master of the soul and a master of the sword, that we'll finally find the true origin of calm. In this video, we're diving into two worlds that collide: Carl Jung's psychological insights and 4 principles of action left by Miyamoto Musashi. They are emotional distance, anticipatory awareness, strategic breathing, and purposeful action. Understanding these changes the way you handle conflict, because once they become practice, calm stops being an exception and becomes a choice. But who exactly was Musashi, and why does he matter here? Born in a time of relentless conflict, Musashi grew up in a world where discipline, strategy, and silence meant more than any speech. From a young age, he wandered Japan armed, facing off against opponents from different schools, with different styles, but always with the same focus in his eyes. He wasn't just there to win, he was there to understand, to test the limits of himself, and slowly, to transcend them. Musashi wasn't chasing fame or glory. He avoided nobility, rejected titles, slept in caves, and trained alone. Everything about him was essential. It was like he was searching, in each fight, for something beyond the outcome. It wasn't about proving strength, it was about mastering precision. That pursuit stayed with him to the end. When he no longer had to prove anything to anyone, he wrote. And what he wrote wasn't just a manual of techniques. It was a manifesto of inner clarity. The Book of 5 Rings is layered. On the surface, it's about combat. But underneath, it's a practical philosophy for staying centered, even when everything around you demands speed, aggression, or ego. That's why Musashi matters here. Not because he fought, but because he understood what it means to stay whole in the middle of confrontation. Because he discovered that it's not the sword that decides the outcome of a battle. It's the presence of the one who holds it. And that ability to stay conscious when everything wants to shatter. That's exactly what Jung called the real inner work. Integrating the opposites, holding the axis, walking through chaos without being consumed by it. Musashi is more than a historical figure. He embodies the archetype of the conscious warrior, a living symbol of someone who went to the edge of tension and came back with wisdom, not trauma. His legacy isn't just in the stories told about him, it's in the principles he lived by. And those principles speak directly to the heart of staying calm when it matters most. And this is where it starts to get interesting. The first principle is emotional distance. The ability to observe an emotion without becoming it. To be present in the heat of conflict without being consumed by it. There's a story told by monks in the Japanese countryside about a young swordsman who, upon learning Musashi would pass through his village, trained obsessively to challenge him. Days and nights of preparation, sharpening his blade, rehearsing every move in front of his reflection on the water. When the moment finally came, he stood ready, eyes wide, chest heaving. Musashi arrived with calm steps, wooden sandals, no visible tension in his body. The crowd parted. Silence fell. The young man clenched his jaw. Sweat dripped. This was the moment he had dreamed of. And inside him, a volcano. Musashi looked at him for a few seconds, like reading a familiar book. And before a single blow was exchanged, the fight was already decided. Because while the boy was fused with his rage, Musashi was watching it from the outside. He saw the fear behind the aggression, the vanity behind the need to prove something. Most of all, he saw instability, and he himself felt none of it. He was just there, fully present. That was his true edge. That's the essence of emotional distance. To stand before the emotion without becoming it. To see anger without becoming anger. To feel fear without surrendering to it. The difference between I feel angry and I am anger might seem subtle, but it decides the course of every conflict, whether external or internal. Musashi wasn't numb. He felt things, but he didn't react impulsively. He observed, and in that observation he created space, a gap between stimulus and response where choice became possible. That gap is what Jung called the transcendent function of consciousness. The moment when the ego doesn't automatically fuse with psychic content, but steps back just enough to reflect, to choose. Most people, when conflict hits, vanish inside their emotions. They lose the thread, the tone, the control. It's like their body's been hijacked. And in a way, it has. Emotional complexes, as Jung described, take over the conscious mind when there's no preparation. And without that inner space, conflict becomes a distorted mirror. You're no longer dealing with the other person. You're battling yourself without realizing it. Musashi trained for that space. He chopped wood, sketched birds, watched leaves dance in the wind, meditated in perfect silence. All of it was training, not for the impact, but for the moment before it. So when tension arose, his presence was stronger than any emotion that tried to hijack his action. Emotional distance isn't coldness. It's self-mastery. And self-mastery isn't repression. It's awareness. It's when you feel everything, yet stay clear. When the emotion flows through you like wind through trees, you hear it, understand it, but you don't break. Emotional distance is feeling without losing yourself in what you feel. It's not becoming the anger someone throws at you. Not letting fear speak on your behalf. It's holding your center, even when everything wants to pull you off it. In daily life, this means something simple. Before you react, notice. Instead of shouting, breathe. Step back. Not physically, but mentally. You feel the wave coming, but don't dive in head first. Imagine you're stepping back inside yourself. Picture the emotion as a wave, and you as the one watching from the shore, not the one getting swept away. Sometimes, all you need is 10 seconds. One lucid thought before the action. That's where the choice begins. Feeling angry? Just say it. I feel angry. That alone changes the game. You are not the anger. You're experiencing it. And once you see the emotion, you can start choosing what to do with it. This applies to everything. A tough conversation, a triggering message, a painful critique. When you build that space between what you feel and what you do, you begin to gain real control. And that's when you can act calmly, firmly, with purpose. That's what Musashi did. And it's what you can start doing, one choice at a time. The second principle is anticipatory awareness. The ability to sense what's coming before it comes. To ready your mind before the world tests it. To read the emotional terrain, not out of fear, but through attention. To know what tends to repeat. And to show up calm before the tension rises. Musashi was known for being late to duels. But it wasn't carelessness, it was deliberate. Often, he arrived hours late, because what he did in that time was part of the fight. While his opponent burned up inside, drowning in anticipation, Musashi was preparing in a different way. He was emptying himself, walking alone, breathing with rhythm, mentally replaying the patterns of the type of fighter he was about to face. He didn't need to know the person, just the emotional forces of anxiety, pride, fear, and how they showed up in people. And in himself. That anticipation wasn't about predicting the future. It was about recognizing patterns. What does the other person tend to do under pressure? What do I usually repeat when I feel threatened, insecure, or dismissed? That reading applies to all human situations, including your own. You don't need a duel to apply this principle. Just pay attention. Today, we'd call this emotional intelligence with strategic awareness. Got a hard conversation ahead? A conflict that can't be avoided? Instead of hoping for the best or spiraling into worst-case scenarios, do what Musashi did. Look calmly at what's in front of you. How does this person usually react to pushback? What signals have they been giving you lately? And you? What's your default when you feel cornered or unseen? That's what it means to anticipate with awareness. You're not inventing stories. You're recognizing what's already there, and getting prepared inside not to repeat the same old patterns. And if you're thinking, but won't I get more anxious preparing like that? The answer is simple. Anxiety grows in the dark, not in clarity. When you anticipate the right way, with presence and intention, what grows is confidence, not fear. You're not rehearsing disasters. You're cultivating stability. Musashi didn't guess what would happen. He simply knew how to observe. He saw things before they happened, because he truly looked. And those who truly look, act better. And those who act better, often avoid what once seemed inevitable. The third principle is strategic breathing, the conscious use of breath to stabilize the body, calm the mind, and stay focused when everything around you demands urgency. Musashi never rushed. Even when conflict was unavoidable, even when the tension filled the air, he moved with a calm so deep it was almost unsettling. His body steady, his gaze centered, his inner rhythm untouched. That calm wasn't a style, it was a technique. Musashi breathed deliberately. He inhaled deeply, exhaled more slowly than he inhaled. He used the rhythm of his breath as an anchor, a center, an invisible shield. They say he followed a pattern that would later be recognized as diaphragmatic breathing with controlled rhythm. Today, science confirms what this does. It activates the parasympathetic nervous system, slows the heart rate, lowers adrenaline, and restores mental clarity. But Musashi didn't need studies. He felt it in his own body. He knew that before mastering the sword, he had to master his presence. When everyone expected tension, he exhaled slowly. When fear tried to creep in, he kept the breath flowing steadily. And while others battled their own loss of control, Musashi was already whole. The technique is simple, but the impact is profound. Today, our battles aren't fought with blades, they're emotional. Arguments, overwhelm, pressure, urgency. And the first thing we lose in these moments is breath. It becomes short, shallow, fast. And when that happens, the body thinks it's under attack, even if the threat is just a message, a demand, a tone of voice. That's why training your breath isn't just a wellness habit. It's a survival strategy for the mind. Here's how it works. When you feel the emotion rising, stop. Inhale for a count of 4. Exhale for a count of 6. Do this 3 or 4 times. No rush. No need to look calm. Just let the air bring you back to yourself. That breathing pattern sends a direct signal to your nervous system. Everything's under control, and once your body believes it, the mind follows. Thoughts slow down. Reactivity weakens. You regain your center, not by accident, but by method. Musashi used breath to keep rhythm in the middle of tension. You can use it in traffic, before answering a harsh message, during a tough meeting, or after unsettling news. That's the third principle. Using your breath as a tool of presence. A small gesture, repeated with intention, that changes the way you move through any conflict. Because when you breathe with awareness, you respond with clarity. The fourth and final principle is purposeful action. Acting from conscious choice, not from impulse. Entering conflict only when necessary, and with a clear reason. Not to prove something, not to win out of pride, but to protect what truly matters. Musashi understood this deeply. At a certain point in life, he began turning down duels. Not because he'd lost his strength, but because he'd found direction. When a young, cocky warrior once tried to provoke him in a public square, Musashi simply looked at him, listened, and walked away. He didn't react, didn't take the bait, because he knew that if he acted to feed his ego, the battle was already lost before it began. That's purpose. Knowing why you're acting, and choosing if it's even worth it. Jung said that when the ego is in charge, we act to protect an image. But when the self guides the action, it comes from a deeper place. A place that doesn't need to win to feel valid. It just needs to stay aligned with what matters. Musashi wasn't passive, but he wasn't impulsive either. He moved with precision. He fought when there was something to protect. A principle, a boundary, a truth. And when there wasn't, he simply didn't fight. Because silence sometimes is stronger than a strike. Bringing this into today is urgent. How often do you react out of vanity? How often do you step into a fight just to feel right? To avoid looking weak? To win? And in the end, win what? Purposeful action means remembering why before deciding how. It means mentally repeating what you want to preserve in that situation. Maybe it's your peace, your boundary, your dignity, or your connection with someone. Holding that clarity before acting changes everything. In practice, it looks like this. Ask, why do I want to say this? And before answering, breathe. If the answer is to prove a point or to unload, it might be time to pause. But if the answer is to clarify, to protect, to uphold what matters, then go ahead. Musashi knew that real strength isn't in striking back. It's in knowing when action is truly necessary. And when it is, acting with full awareness of what's at stake. That's the presence that doesn't get pulled by the emotion of the moment. That doesn't move to serve the ego, but to sustain what truly counts. But Musashi also knew the real battle wasn't in the duels. It was with the monsters inside. He spent much of his life in silence, not out of shyness but out of clarity. He knew the real enemy rarely screams. He trained alone, spoke little, withdrew, not as escape, but as focus. Something within him needed listening, and it wouldn't be found at the surface. No warrior wins as much or writes a work like the Book of Five Rings without facing their own shadows. Musashi did it far from the spotlight. It's in the subtext of what he wrote, in the contrast between the sword and his art, in the solitude he chose, even when fame and followers were within reach. Jung called this the confrontation with the shadow. All the things the ego refuses to see, fears, vanities, repressed drives. It's not evil, it's what's been denied. And the more you bury it, the more it returns as anger, fear, or control. Musashi didn't bury it. He walked toward it. He fought less against others and more against what in him still needed to prove, to conquer, to be seen. With each duel, he cut less of the opponent and more of his internal excess. Each silence was a confrontation, each retreat, a win over the ego. Jung said, to mature is to integrate the shadow, to face what bothers you, to own what you project. Musashi lived that in his own way, not through words, but through action. And he showed that real strength doesn't come from outward victories. It comes from stopping the flight inward. There's a point where the sword stops being a symbol of combat. It still represents cutting, but not of flesh, of illusions, of excess, of false identities. For Musashi, that shift wasn't theory. It happened over time, through the wear of repetition, through realizing that fighting the world meant nothing without inner clarity. When Jung described individuation, he wasn't talking about self-help or some dreamy psychological ideal. He was describing a real, gritty, often uncomfortable process. The continuous effort to become who you truly are. Not in a social or idealized sense, but through deep integration of light and shadow, reason and instinct, what's accepted and what's denied. A process that involves confrontation, loss, silence, and rebuilding. Musashi lived this with his whole being. With every fight something dissolved. The image, the pride, the role. He began to see that the most dangerous force wasn't his opponent. It was inside. The unrecognized impulses, the disguised desires, the raw emotions that rise when pressure hits. It was no longer about defeating someone, but about not betraying what had already been earned within. That's what individuation is. Fighting a war no one sees, but one that changes everything. And in that process, there are no guarantees. It's not about becoming perfect, but about becoming whole, no longer depending on the world's approval to feel real. When Musashi stepped away from public duels and retreated into creation, writing, and stillness, he was living exactly that. He didn't disappear. He reorganized. Jung said the self, that deeper center of the psyche, only emerges when the ego bows, when the ego realizes it's not the king, but the servant. And Musashi, through all his battles, seemed to understand that. By the end of his journey, he had nothing left to prove. No applause could shake him. No criticism could reach him. That kind of strength doesn't come from outside. It's born in the crossing. And each of us, in our own way, has to make that journey. There was a time when Musashi was sought after to impress. His name carried weight, and many saw him as the perfect image of the invincible warrior. But instead of feeding that image, he began to step away from it. He turned down invitations, avoided public displays, even abandoned the titles attached to his name. It was as if he knew that the more he fed the idealized figure, the more he'd drift away from himself. Jung would call this a break with the persona. In analytical psychology, the persona is the mask we wear to face the world. A social construct, functional, even necessary, but one that becomes dangerous when mistaken for our real identity. When someone identifies too closely with their role, they stop acting as they are, and start acting as they think they should. In that performance, spontaneity dies. The soul shrinks. Musashi saw this early. He knew that reacting to maintain an image was a subtle form of weakness. Because those who live to uphold a role act out of defense, not choice. They're trapped in others' gaze, reacting out of vanity, fear of disappointment, or the need to prove something. At that point, reactivity stops being a response and becomes the maintenance of a character. True calm requires breaking that habit. It means seeing yourself from within, beyond the performance, stopping the fight for wounded pride, not confusing yourself with the role of the strong, the wise, the superior, because all these archetypes, if not transcended, turn into cages. By stepping out of the spotlight, Musashi was getting closer to himself. He let the public persona fade. He allowed himself to just be a man who thinks, who observes, who feels, who breathes deeply before acting, who listens to what's alive inside before drawing his sword, or deciding not to draw it. That gesture, which might look like renunciation, is actually maturity. It's the moment when reactivity gives way to presence. When your response comes not from the role you're expected to play, but from the center that's already awake. In many of the records that survive about Musashi, one thing always stands out: the silence. Not just the stillness of the body, but of the mind that doesn't rush. A calm that isn't the absence of thought, but full presence in each gesture. The state of someone who doesn't chase control, because they already dwell at the center of their own movement. Musashi drew birds, painted bamboo, watched how the light filtered through leaves. He spent long stretches in contemplation, seemingly doing nothing. But it wasn't escape, it was preparation. A way to clear his mind of noise, to hear what really mattered. That kind of mind, free of distractions and noise, is described in Eastern traditions as a Zen mind, a state that doesn't seek explanations or immediate answers, just presence. It's not passivity. It's readiness without tension, like water that adapts without losing its essence. Jung, though Western, was fascinated by this kind of consciousness. He saw in Eastern thought something modern psychology still struggled to name, a kind of knowing that bypasses language, a silent wisdom that emerges when the ego stops yelling. He believed the self, the deeper center of the psyche, reveals itself most clearly in this state. When the ego mind quiets down, the self can speak. Musashi lived in that space. He wasn't just a strategist, he was an artist, a meditator, a student of impermanence. His strength came from being able to sustain silence without discomfort, to act only when action was necessary, to remain still, not from fear, but from inner command. That connection with the creative void is what gave his presence a weight no one could imitate. It wasn't just talent, it was inner discipline. It came from clearing his mind of haste, noise, and the need to prove, so he could simply be there, whole. And that wholeness, that mind that breathes in sync with the body and the world around it, is the core of a centered heart. It's where the right response is born, where conflict doesn't throw you off, where calm isn't a technique, it's your natural state. It's easy to think of conflict as a disruption, something that throws you off your path, that breaks your routine, that threatens your balance. But for Jung, conflict isn't noise. It's a message. It's the exact point where two parts of the psyche collide, and, if worked through, can transform. Musashi seemed to understand this without needing words. He didn't avoid conflict, but he didn't seek it either. He faced it with presence, with clarity, as if knowing that every tension carried a mirror, something to be revealed, something to be crossed. His journey wasn't about imposing strength, but refining it. Every conflict he lived through was, in truth, an opportunity for integration. And that's the key Jung offers to those who look deeper. What irritates us, wounds us, destabilizes us, carries an invitation, a gateway to the part of our awareness still fragmented, a portal into the shadow, and, if we're lucky, beyond it. When Musashi walked away from empty provocations, he was saying, "This conflict isn't mine." When he accepted a confrontation, it was with purpose. When he stayed silent, it wasn't omission. It was listening. He used conflict as a measure, as a tool, as a step forward. Jung said psychological growth comes from tension between opposites. No tension, no real movement. And without conflict, no tension. That's why the moments when we feel most shaken are often the ones that most reveal who we are. If we don't run, if we walk through them. Calm, then, isn't the absence of conflict. It's the ability to move through it without losing your center, to look at the friction with steady eyes, with stable breath, with clear purpose, to respond not by reflex, but by choice, to understand that every clash is also a chance to reunite parts of ourselves that were still disconnected. The principles we've explored, emotional distance, anticipatory awareness, strategic breathing, purposeful action, aren't techniques. They're layers of the same awakening. The realization that calm was never about controlling the outside world. It's about recognizing that you are already the place where silence lives. Musashi cut through enemies. Jung cut through illusions. But both arrived at the same truth. The most important battle isn't the one you fight against the world. It's the one you end inside yourself. And when that happens, the sword can fall. Because the only victory that ever mattered has already been won. If you made it this far, drop a comment below. I choose to stay calm. That way, I'll know you stayed till the end, and that this message landed with you. And if you want to help this channel go even further, hit the super thanks button below. That financial support is what makes it possible to keep bringing you meaningful content, crafted with care, research, and intention. Every contribution counts, and keeps this conversation alive. Thank you for being here. See you in the next video.